I wanted to share a story about a time that I was nearly diagnosed bipolar, because I think that a lot of people going through spiritual awakenings experience intense emotions, and depending on what culture you live in, you could be labeled, diagnosed, and medicated for a process that can be handled in a more gentle, less numbing kind of way. But here's my story. Around 1998 or so, I took a break from my fledgling tarot business and decided I wanted to go for a drive up on South Mountain in Phoenix, Arizona. And I had been up there before, usually at night. But when I was up there during the day, I looked down on the valley and just, there's a lot of mountains around central Phoenix and the whole metro Phoenix area, and it kind of collects the pollution. And there was a brown haze over the whole area, and it just looked really ugly to me. It just felt like, I don't want to breathe this stuff. And at the same time, I was having a synchronicity related to the song on the radio. It was a Bob Seger song, something about rolling away or whatever, hopping on a motorcycle and going off, leaving everything, that kind of thing. I remember there was a line about, I could go east, I could go west, it was all up to me to decide. And I thought, you know what, I would rather go live in a less populated area. So I drove north immediately, just a real spontaneous thing, up to a small town about hour and a half, 2 hours north of Phoenix. And it was in a mountainous region, lots of trees, lots of clean air, very peaceful and so forth. And one thing led to another, and pretty quickly I moved up there, probably within a matter of weeks of this revelation that I no longer wanted to be in this polluted area. So this was the second of three times in my life that I was living away from people that I knew. This first was in Santa Cruz, and the third is now here in Northern California. And I've found in each time that I live away from people that I know, I go pretty deep into my awareness. I think that, and each three of these times I was not in a relationship. So when you remove yourself from the familiarity of people that you know, then a lot of self-examination naturally comes up in that aloneness. Because if you're in a relationship, or if you have a group of friends that you're always doing things with, then there's certain kind of norms that form, and you just kind of go along doing your thing. But I found, as I started examining myself, and I didn't know it at the time, but part of my grief coming up was that I did not have as solid as a support network as I thought I did. But I told myself I did, but something felt wrong. So I felt that I was kind of depressed or something, and I decided, okay, well, I know there's a counseling agency or whatever near here that a woman who had taught me tarot years ago had mentioned to me that a friend of hers ran it, and that it was pretty spiritually oriented, and kind of they kept things low-key so they could get state funding, but that it was a pretty conscious group of people. And I thought, well, this would be good. I'd done therapy at different times in my life before that, usually related to relational issues or depression or whatever. And I thought this would be a good time to do that, since I was in a period of, not feeling horrible, but could use some maintenance. So I went in for my intake, and the woman was my friend's friend, and so I thought this was going to be cool. But I was really excited and intense after spending so much time alone, just talking to somebody about the revelations I was having, and just the different realizations, and just, I was really speaking with a very pressured kind of tone. And so anyways, she wanted to diagnose me as bipolar. Now, fortunately, I had already worked as a therapist. I had a Master of Counseling degree, and so I could distinguish. In fact, I had facilitated a group for people diagnosed with bipolar disorder, and that did not feel right to me at all when she said that that's what I was experiencing. Plus, I had, by that point, become pretty familiar with spirituality, and I realized I was going through an intense spiritual awakening. So, I basically contradicted her assessment, and then she agreed eventually because I was not going for days without sleep, which is one of the symptoms commonly associated with this disorder. And but the thing is, if I had not been as aware of my process going through a spiritual awakening, and if I had not been trained as a therapist, I would have just gone along with it because here's an expert telling me what I am. And then if I believed that's who I was, that's really self-defeating. If you're going through a spiritual awakening and you're told that you have a disease, and then you take pretty intense medication for a disease — I never took any medication for that, contraindicated diagnosis — but if I had started getting into that and believing that, my whole life would have changed until I realized that diagnosis was not who I am. Now, I'm not completely opposed to medication if somebody is having a hard time functioning, but I do believe a lot of times what we call bipolar, or previously manic depression, the terms of these things change in the DSM as stigma arises. They'll change the term if there's a stigma around it. But anyhow, if we buy into our disease mentality that we have in Western culture in particular, then we start acting in a way that we suspect those kind of people are going to act. And regarding medication, yeah, if you're not having the ability to function in the world and medication helps, then that's great. But for myself, what I needed to go through was deeper understanding from a spiritual perspective of who I was and what I was realizing that I had always suppressed. I think that what can feel like bipolar disorder is often, if we are in a dysfunctional system, whether it's obviously dysfunctional or subtly dysfunctional, we suppress who we are. We suppress a lot of things into our unconscious. We suppress things and they manifest as somatic bodily symptoms and so forth. They affect our energy. They affect our ability to really stay grounded, centered, and clear. So we start then, when things are suppressed, they come up, and it could be a really exciting, intense revelation. Or if you're suppressed, you could manifest a depressed type energy and so forth. So anyhow, it can look like an unstable and feel like an unstable experience, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you have some kind of dysfunctional brain chemistry that needs to be treated with medication. So the counselor that I was assigned to was pretty cool. He normally worked out of Sedona, but would travel and work at this place sometimes as well. And Sedona is very spiritually oriented kind of town, and he was very spiritually oriented. He had this aura machine. I can't remember what it's called. I later purchased one for a bit. I had one myself. It basically would look at your aura, your chakras, measure through your fingers what kind of energy you had at each chakra point and stuff. And I remember using this with him, and then he said to me, oh, because I had told him that I was working as a tarot reader and that I was fairly psychic, and he said, you are psychic. A lot of people think they are, but they're really not. And but I think he was seeing a lot of energy in my third eye area was what he was basing that on. And as we spoke, he said to me something that I always remembered, which was, you're not depressed, you're suppressed. And interestingly, when I learned tarot from the woman who recommended this counseling agency years prior, she taught me the Osho Zen Tarot, and one of the cards in there was suppression. And it was getting the suppression card that led me from accepting a position as a therapist with a group of really respected therapists in the Phoenix area. I had already accepted it, actually, and then the suppression card came up, and I realized it's not what I really wanted to do. And so I got into the internet, and that has continued on since then. So when he said, you're not depressed, you're suppressed, that really resonated for me. Things needed to come out. I'd grown up being a good boy so that I would be liked and not cause stress for people and so forth, but that my truth was coming up and coming out. And so yeah, it was helpful to work with this counselor. And also at this point in my life, I had yet to learn how having an unstable kind of survival root chakra energy, the base chakra is root to our survival needs, by that being unstable still, at that point in my life, I did not understand how that was exacerbating everything else, because I was stressed out on that core level, and I needed to learn more about work and the yang side of things and supporting myself and not be stressed out about basic needs and so forth. So, and that would continue on for some time until I think a real turning point for me was when my father last spoke to me about a month before his death. He told me 3 things that really stayed with me and were a great catalyst. And I don't even know how he knew these about me, because I hadn't talked to him for years, and we had a very distant relationship for probably a decade. No, not a decade. My math was way off there. 2002 from 1990. We had a strange relationship for about 4 or 5 years. 5 years. And so anyways, he knew somehow, and I think Spirit may have been kind of communicating this through him in a certain degree. 3 things that helped me quite a bit make a transition in my life, which was, he said, first, I get concerned that you're not willing to do the little things, the boring things, the monotonous things that you need to do to have the kind of success that you want. And that was very relevant for the work that I was doing. It's like if I was going to be in business on the internet, I was still in a zone where I would not push myself to make the best looking website that I could make and study marketing and things like that. I was just willing to compromise. So what he said about doing the little things you need to do to have the success you want really resonated for me. Secondly, he said, don't spend all the money that you make. He had gotten in trouble, I think that added to his own stress later in life, by spending a lot on the ideal dream home that he built in Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and then was left with some stress about finances and so forth. And I guess I had always, I knew by that point I had to save enough for taxes working for myself, so that got me, into saving more. But then over time I realized there's a great security that comes with having savings and preparing for unpredictable events related to work. So I've been a saver for like close to 10 years now, and I think his advice helped me with that. And lastly, he said, don't invest in the stock market. He had lost a lot of money in that as well, I think after 9/11. And there have been times where I've been tempted to put a portion of my savings into it, but I do feel that on a core level, I like just having my money in an online savings account, getting a solid, predictable 1.25% yield, as opposed to possibly making much more or possibly losing. The thought of losing money is not appealing to me, given the volatility of the stock market and so forth. So the point of all this was that these are perspectives that help me with the root chakra, the survival issue, and that a lot of people, if you're going through some kind of spiritual awakening, you're probably sensitive to energy, and it can be really intense. And I think a lot of core fears that we carry with us are fear of death, fear of losing our mind, and that even if you're physically healthy, you might fear that you're losing your mind if you're starting to experience synchronicities and insights and prophetic dreams and other kinds of powerful experiences. So keep in mind, if you're going through these things, that it might not be best to, if you're still functional, if you're still able to take care of yourself, medication might not be necessary. Now, if you can't even function, you can't support yourself, it could be that medication could help you to get back on track, but don't identify with disease. Know that that's culturally bound, kind of like in the West we have all kinds of problems with eating disorders because of cultural values related to body identification and all this kind of stuff, but there are some parts of the world where it does not exist. And so keep that in mind too. With if you're having a spiritual discomfort, that doesn't mean that you have a chemical oriented disease in your brain. So thanks for listening. I appreciate it. Have a good day.